They say some silences are louder than screams. Hers was the kind that filled an entire house. Every morning, Evelyn woke before the sun, her bones aching, her breath slow. The kettle would whistle and she'd pour 2 cups of coffee. One for him, one for herself, though she'd stopped drinking coffee years ago. She only kept the ritual because he liked it that way. That was how life worked in that house, his way, always his way. Robert would come down the stairs, same heavy steps, same cold greeting. He'd glance at her face but never see her eyes. 32 years of marriage had turned him into something that spoke without feeling, and her into something that listened without a voice. The walls once remembered her laughter, faint echoes buried under layers of paint and silence. Now all they heard was the clock ticking between them. When she was younger, Evelyn had dreams, paint-stained hands, art shows, the smell of fresh canvas. She wanted color. But he wanted order. That art nonsense doesn't feed anybody, he'd said once, snatching a half-finished painting from her hands. He never hit her, never shouted, but the quiet disapproval was enough to bruise her spirit. Slowly she stopped painting, stopped laughing, stopped being. Her children grew up and left. They called sometimes. On birthdays. Holidays. Each time her voice sounded cheerful, steady. "I'm fine, baby," she'd say. "You just take care of yourself." And she meant it. Or maybe she just wanted them to believe it. Because truth was a dangerous thing inside that house. It could get you hurt even without a single blow. There was one day she never forgot. A Sunday morning. The light was soft, drifting through the kitchen curtains. Robert sat at the table reading his paper, muttering about politics. Evelyn placed his breakfast down, a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast cut just the way he liked. But that morning something in her felt different. Maybe it was the way the sunlight touched her hands, reminding her they were still hers. Maybe it was the silence pressing against her chest. She looked at him and asked softly, "Do you ever see me anymore, Robert?" He didn't even look up. "What kind of question is that?" She smiled faintly. "Just wondering." That was the first time in years she said something that wasn't about groceries or laundry. And for the first time she realized he didn't care enough to answer. That night, lying beside him, she stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark, "I used to exist." It wasn't anger that filled her, it was grief. The grief of being invisible while alive. A few months later Robert had a small stroke. Nothing fatal. But it left him weaker, quieter. He hated the pity in people's eyes. Evelyn cared for him like she always had, washed his clothes, cooked his meals, helped him to bed. But something inside her had changed. She no longer did it out of duty. She did it with a strange calm, the kind that comes when you finally stop hoping for change. Each night after he fell asleep, she'd sit in the living room with her old sketchbook. It had been years since she'd touched it. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through yellowed pages filled with forgotten colors. Then she began to draw again, slowly, silently, faces of women who looked like her. Tired. Beautiful. Invisible. She drew until her hands ached and her eyes burned. And with every stroke she reclaimed a piece of herself. Weeks turned into months. Her art began to fill the attic. Dozens of portraits, women of age, sorrow, and grace. Each one whispered her name back to her. She'd smile softly like a secret. One evening her daughter, Carla, visited. She hadn't been home in over a year. When she saw the paintings she gasped. "Mama, you did all this?" Evelyn nodded shyly. "They were just waiting," she said. Carla hugged her, tears in her eyes. "Mama, people need to see this." That night, for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to imagine a life beyond those walls. A small art show, maybe at the community center. Nothing big. Just something to tell the world she existed. But Robert laughed when she mentioned it. "Art show? At your age? Ain't nobody got time for that, Evelyn." She said nothing. But deep inside something stirred. A quiet defiance. The same way soil breaks when the first seed pushes through. She started painting every night after he slept, hiding her canvases under old sheets. The colors grew bolder. Deep reds, golds, the kind of hues that demand to be seen. Her silence was changing shape. It was turning into art, into survival, into revenge. One morning she stood at the kitchen window watching the sunrise. The world outside looked free. And for the first time in decades she whispered to herself, "I'm still here." Her reflection in the glass smiled back. Not the wife. Not the caretaker. Not the invisible woman. Just Evelyn, the woman who had finally started to remember who she was. But she didn't know yet that the silence she carried all these years was about to become her weapon. Robert's health grew worse that year. His body began to betray him in the small, humiliating ways men fear most. He hated asking for help. He hated needing her. But Evelyn was there, quiet, gentle, steady. The same woman he had once silenced was now the one keeping him alive. Funny how life circles back like that. Each morning she'd help him sit by the window, wrap a blanket around his legs, and watch him pretend he didn't need her. "You don't have to," he'd mutter. And she'd answer softly, "I know." Then she'd walk away before he could see the flicker of peace in her eyes. It wasn't kindness anymore, it was control. The quiet kind. At night she painted. Her world was small but glowing again. The attic smelled of turpentine and rain. On the walls hung faces of every woman she had ever been. Evelyn the wife, Evelyn the mother, Evelyn the ghost. But among them all, one portrait stood different. It was unfinished. A woman's face, half in light, half in shadow. She didn't know why, but she always stopped before painting the eyes. Maybe because she wasn't ready to see herself completely yet. One afternoon Carla came by again. She brought flyers from a local art exhibit. The theme was Women Who Waited. Evelyn smiled at the title. "That's all I've ever done," she said quietly. Carla convinced her to submit a few pieces. "Mama, it's time," she whispered. Evelyn hesitated. She could almost hear Robert's voice echoing in her head, sharp as ever. "Don't go making a fool of yourself." That night she stood before the unfinished portrait, brush trembling in her hand. "Not this time," she murmured. She dipped her brush into a deep golden hue, the color of rebirth, and painted the eyes, soft, steady, alive. When she stepped back she gasped. The woman on the canvas was her, older, braver, free. For the first time in years, Evelyn cried. Not from pain but from recognition. 2 weeks later her paintings hung in that small community gallery. The room smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. People stopped, stared, whispered. "Who did these?" someone asked. "Her name's Evelyn Brooks," said the organizer. Evelyn stood in the corner, hands clasped, heart racing. She hadn't felt seen in decades. Then Carla took her hand and whispered, "Look, Mama, they're feeling your silence." She smiled faintly. "That's all I ever wanted." When she came home that evening the house was dark. Robert sat in his chair, the TV flickering against his tired face. "You went?" he asked, his voice low. "I did." He stared at her, jaw tight. "All these years you couldn't stand up for nothing. Now you think you somebody." Evelyn didn't answer. She walked past him, slow, calm, like wind moving through an empty hall. He called after her again, louder this time, but she kept walking. The old Evelyn would have stopped, explained, begged for peace. But the woman who returned that night had found her peace somewhere else. Days passed. The gallery called. It had been a success. They wanted her to do more. A small newspaper ran a feature titled, "The Woman Who Found Her Voice Through Silence." Neighbors started dropping by, congratulating her, asking about her art. Robert hated every minute of it. The attention. The laughter. The light coming back into the house that had lived in shadow too long. One morning he snapped. "You embarrassed me, Evelyn. You think painting makes you important? You ain't nothing without me." She turned to him slowly. "Maybe," she said softly. "But even nothing can grow roots if you leave it in the dark long enough." He didn't understand her words, but something in her tone, calm, almost tender, made him go quiet. For the first time he saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. Freedom. Not the loud kind but the dangerous kind. The kind you can't control. After that she stopped explaining herself. She painted more, smiled more, moved through the house like she belonged again. When he grumbled she didn't answer. When he mocked she simply looked at him like he was fading away, which in a way he was. Then came the night of the storm. The power went out. The rain beat against the windows, wild and endless. Robert called for her from his chair, angry, helpless. "Evelyn. My meds. Where are you at?" She walked in slowly, candlelight flickering across her face. "I got them," she said. "Don't worry." She placed the pills in his hand and turned to go. "Stay here," he said suddenly. His voice was softer, almost pleading. "Don't leave me alone." She stopped in the doorway, the candle flame trembling between them. You never minded being alone before, she said quietly. He looked at her and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes, not of her but of the emptiness that would remain when she finally stopped caring. She stood there for a long moment watching him, then whispered, "You taught me how to live in silence, Robert. Now it's your turn." He blew out the candle. The room went dark. Only the sound of the storm remained. The storm lasted all night. By morning the house felt heavier, quieter than usual. Rainwater trickled down the windows, leaving long trembling trails like tear marks on glass. Evelyn moved through the rooms slowly, her slippers brushing the old wooden floor. Robert was still asleep in his chair, head slumped forward, breath shallow but steady. She stood there for a long while watching him and realized something strange. She felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no hate. Just release. The silence that once buried her now wrapped around her like peace. Later that day Carla came over. "Mama, you okay? You sound different on the phone." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Different can be good, baby." They sat in the kitchen sipping tea while the world outside smelled of wet soil and clean air. "Mama," Carla said softly, "are you gonna keep taking care of him like that? You don't have to, you know." Evelyn looked out the window, the gray sky reflected in her eyes. "I'm not taking care of him anymore," she said. "I'm just watching time finish what I started." That evening she went up to the attic again. The air was cool, soft, almost holy. Her paintings stood everywhere, rows and rows of faces that told her story better than words ever could. She began working on a new one. A man sitting in a chair surrounded by darkness, while a woman stood at the edge of the frame holding a candle. Her face calm. Her eyes bright. As she painted she realized the candle's light didn't just touch her face. It reached the man too. That was the moment she understood her revenge was never about making him suffer. It was about surviving long enough to make his cruelty meaningless. About proving that the silence he once forced on her had become her weapon, her armor, her art. Weeks turned into months. Robert's health declined quickly. The house nurse came 3 times a week now. Evelyn paid her bills with the money she earned from her art sales. Her paintings were selling. Small galleries, online auctions, interviews. People called her the silent painter. They said her work had a power that felt ancient, like pain made visible. She never explained the story behind them. She just smiled and said, "They come from the quiet places." One afternoon she got a call from the City Gallery in Charleston. They wanted to feature her in a solo exhibition. Her name on the banner, her work across the walls. She hung up the phone and sat still for a long time, tears rolling down her cheeks. The woman who once couldn't raise her voice would now have her silence displayed for the world to see. That night she went to Robert's room. He was awake, weaker than ever, his breath a soft rattle. He looked at her and whispered, "You win, Evelyn." She leaned closer. It wasn't a game. He tried to smile but couldn't. "You changed," he said. "No," she whispered. "I just stopped disappearing." He closed his eyes. "I was scared you'd leave." "I did," she said softly. "You just didn't notice." For a long time neither of them spoke. The room was filled with the quiet hum of a life that had finally run out of words. Then she stood up, kissed his forehead gently and whispered, "Rest now. I already forgave you." When she left the room she didn't look back. The next morning Robert was gone. Peaceful. So, the nurse said he went in his sleep. Evelyn didn't cry. She simply stood at the window as sunlight poured across the floorboards, turning everything gold. The house that once trapped her now felt weightless, empty in a beautiful way. In the weeks that followed she prepared for her gallery show. On opening night the crowd gathered around her work. Faces she didn't know, voices full of admiration. She wore a long cream dress, her silver hair wrapped neatly, her eyes glowing with quiet confidence. Near the center of the gallery hung her latest piece. The man in the chair and the woman with the candle. Below it she had written a single line. "Some silences are not weakness. Some are survival." As the crowd moved through the room, Evelyn stood still, her heart steady. For the first time in her life she felt entirely seen, not as someone's wife or caretaker or shadow, but as herself. Later that night when everyone had gone she stayed behind to walk through the gallery one last time. The lights were dim, the air soft and echoing. She stopped in front of the painting and smiled. "You see, Robert," she whispered into the quiet, "I didn't need to scream. I just needed to paint. Then she turned off the lights and her footsteps faded into the silence she carried. Not the silence of pain but the silence of freedom.